Section 5. Answer. Third. If this assertion be true and solid, and tradition be an infallible foundation of faith, as those men pretend, no error could come into the Church under pretense of tradition from the apostles. This is evident in itself. Else an infallible authority is liable to error, which is a contradiction. And it is granted by our adversaries, who therefore can tell us that all heretics recede from the tradition of their fathers and broach new and unheard of doctrines, as we have seen. But errors may come into the Church under pretense of tradition. Here all the doubt lies, and therefore I shall endeavor to make it good, a task which would be wholly superfluous if the impudence of our adversaries and the desperateness of their cause did not oblige them to require and us to give the proof of the most evident verities. I might insist upon the doctrine of Chiliasts, which the Papists confess to be false, which was commended to the Church by Papias and Irenaeus too as an apostolical tradition, and so received by the generality of Orthodox Christians, saith Justin Martyr. This argument is rendered more considerable by the pitiful evasion wherewith Mr. White shuffles it off, saying that the Chiliasts were deceived by Cerinthus, who feigned he had this from the apostles in private discourses, not in public preaching. For, to say nothing of this, that the fathers derived its pedigree from another root, whatever was the occasion and ground of this mistake in the tradition, it sufficiently proves that I invented, that is, that many, or most of the guides of the Church may receive false doctrines as coming from the apostles, and so transmit them to their posterity, which is a thing now denied. It was an old observation of Irenaeus concerning the heretics of his time. One would think the words were not only historical of them, but also prophetical of the Papists. When heretics are reproved out of the Scripture, they begin to accuse the Scripture, as if truth could not be discovered by those that know not tradition. The Arians pretend they had their doctrine by tradition from their ancestors. Particularly they named Origen, Dionysius, Alexandrius, and Lucian the martyr, by whose hands their doctrine had been conveyed to them, as Baronius acknowledges. Epiphanius tells us that Cajani pretended St. Paul as the author and founder of their heretical doctrines. The Pelagians boasted of their doctrine, that it had been always celebrated by the learning of holy men. The doctrine of rebaptization, which the Papists acknowledged to be erroneous, was brought in by Cyprian and the African bishops under a pretense of tradition. The words of Cyprian are these: "We do not now broach a new doctrine, but one long since decreed by our predecessors." It is true, Pamelius saith, he means this of his immediate predecessors, Agrippus and the rest, and that will serve my turn, if Mr. White's argument will hold, for then no age, and consequently not this, could either be ignorant of or knowingly recede from the doctrine of their fathers, nor they from their fathers, and so upward to the apostles. And indeed, Cyprian carries it higher, even to the apostle, while he calls it the faith of the Catholic Church, and reckons it amongst the apostolical and evangelical precepts, and Firmilian expressly affirms it was delivered by Christ and his apostles. And will these men's confidence yet serve them to assert that no error could come into the Church by tradition? If all those eminent African bishops and churches might either misunderstand their ancestors or deceive their posterity, as Mr. White cannot deny they did either the one or the other, why might not the Spanish or French or Romish do it? If it be said there was a promise to the contrary, at least for the Church of Rome. To say nothing of the manifest weakness of that pretense, I answer two things. First, that Mr. White expressly rejects this infallibility by promise. Secondly, however, this argument being of another nature, and depending not upon the promise of God, but the nature and evidence of the thing, is by this instance irrefragably overthrown. Answer. Fourth. That way of proving which was rejected by the prophets and godly Jews, by Christ and the apostles, by Christ and by the apostles, is not to be approved, much less preferred, before that way which they approved and used. But this way of proving the truth of a doctrine by tradition from their next ancestors and the testimony of the present Church was rejected by the prophets, and by Christ and the apostles. Ergo, it is not now to be approved. For the minor, in which all the doubt lies, it consists of two branches, the first relating to the Old Testament, the second to the New. The first is, that this way was disowned by the prophets and godly Jews under the Old Testament. It is true, some of the Jews did own this popish opinion, as you may read in Jeremiah 44, verse 17, but the prophets were of another persuasion, Ezekiel 20, verse 18. Walk not in the statutes of your fathers. And from tradition they used to send their people to the law and to the testimony, Isaiah 8, verse 20. And the godly kings of Judah did not make tradition, as the papists do, but the written law, as the Protestants do, the rule of their Reformation. Thus David in 1 Chronicles 16, verse 40, to do according to all that is written in the law. Thus Hezekiah in 2 Chronicles 31, he did all as it is written in the law of the Lord. So Josiah in 2 Chronicles 34, verses 30 and 31, and 2 Chronicles 35, verse 12. The like did Ezra long after in Ezra 6, verse 18, and Nehemiah chapter 8. They dwelt in booths, as it is written. Here Scripture recovers what tradition had lost. For though God had commanded this, yet since the days of Joshua they had not done so. Verse 17. By all which we evidently discern how different their opinion was from this of the papists, and how little confidence they put in tradition. Josiah would not so much as make Hezekiah's reformation his rule, nor Hezekiah take his pattern from Jehoshaphat's reformation, but still every one had immediate recourse to the written word. For it seems it was a language that these holy men understood not, that Scripture was a corrupt writing, a laden rule, a dumb master.